Thanks for joining us for another edition of Religious Hardtalk. I'm Ian Boyne. We continue our dialogue on the issue of the Sabbath. It's still a burning issue among Christians. This issue is still being debated, is still being contested. We want to supply you with some of the best arguments, hopefully, that are out there, some of the best arguments on both sides. And so my guest, Elsie Thunder Lauriston, a former Seventh-day Adventist evangelist and theology student at Northern Caribbean University. He's here to defend the anti-Sabbatarian position, and I'm defending the position of the Sabbatarians. I'm giving a lecture this coming Saturday, November the 25th. At the Sagicor Auditorium at 4:30. I'm giving a lecture on this matter. I want to give a full presentation looking at both sides of the issue, but giving the arguments for Sabbatarianism. I hope you'll come out this Saturday, Sagicor Auditorium, November 25th at 4:30 in the afternoon. And to help you along with the discussion, my guest, Elsie, has written this book, All Foods Are Clean and Every Day is Sabbath. Get a copy of this book also. So we want the discussion to continue after this evening. So we want you to read Elsie's book and come out to my lecture this Saturday at the Sagicor Auditorium at 4:30 p.m. Sagicor Auditorium in New Kingston. So, Brother Elsie, what are your main lines of evidence from the New Testament against continued Sabbath keeping?
Discontinued, rather.
Yes.
The attitude and mindset of the Jews coming from the Old Testament into the intertestamental period and into the New Testament regarding the Sabbath did not change. They still saw the Sabbath as exclusive to Israel. Circumcision took precedence over it to the point that, as Jesus said in John chapter 7, verses 22 to 23, if the eighth day of a child falls on the Sabbath when he ought to be circumcised, that trumps the Sabbath. A Jew is not a Jew until he's circumcised, and that is why circumcision took precedence over it. For example, Jubilees chapter 2, verse 31, which is an apocryphal Jewish book, which says, the Creator of all blessed it, that is the Sabbath, but he did not sanctify any people or nations to keep it thereon. With the sole exception of Israel, he granted them alone that they may eat and drink and keep the Sabbath thereon upon the face of the earth. Also, the Jewish Talmud says the children of Noah were given 7 laws. The observance of the Sabbath is not among them. We also have sayings from the rabbis who says, why does it says the Lord has given you, speaking of Israel, the Sabbath. He has not given it to the heathen. It is a virtue. It is in virtue of this that the sages stated that if the heathen observe the Sabbath, then not only won't they receive a reward, but they are even to be considered transgression. As a matter of fact, they were so serious that they even had laws against Gentiles keeping the Sabbath without being circumcised, to the point that if a Gentile, and let me read you the exact quote, a non-Jew who observes the Sabbath while he is uncircumcised incurs liability for the punishment of death. Why? Because non-Jews were never commanded concerning it. The Sabbath is a reunion between Israel and God, as it said, it is a sign between me and you, Exodus 31:17 quoted. Therefore, any non-Jew who, being uncircumcised, thrusts himself between them, incurs the penalty of death. Gentiles have not been commanded to observe the Sabbath. So not only did the Mosaic law serve as a wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, but also the Sabbath. And this brings to fresh light Ephesians chapter 2, which says Jesus has broken down the law of commandments contained in ordinances, which the Sabbath was. He has broken it down to the point that these things no longer identify Christians, they're no longer binding on Christians. As a matter of fact, the New Testament authors and apostles condemns and considers to be Judaizers those who seek to promote dietary rules and restrictions, mandatory Sabbath keeping, and law-based salvation for Christians, whether as entry markers or as continuing identity markers. And the Sabbath was a key feature of Judaism that served to segregate it from the rest of the world. Let me name a few of them. Food rules, their dressing, the Sabbath, and the feast. And circumcision would have been the primary one. These were key identifying markers of Judaism, and that mindset continued into the New Testament. And that is why we don't observe much debate about the Sabbath in the New Testament, because circumcision preceded it. And so there's a huge argument about circumcision, but there's nothing about the Sabbath with a few mention, because you could not keep the Sabbath as a Gentile. You could not begin to thrust yourself upon the Sabbath without first undergoing circumcision. So when the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 rule out circumcision, they automatically rule out the law of Moses, Sabbath keeping, etc., as requisites or necessary for Gentiles as part and parcel of new covenant faith in Jesus Christ. So when I look at that, that is strong indication of the non-continuance of Sabbath keeping. And of course, I hope I can flesh out much more the three strongest anti-Sabbatarian passages that I see in the New Testament: Colossians 2, Galatians, and Romans 14. As a matter of fact, my whole book is on Romans 14, responding to Adventism on it, and I connect that with Colossians 2 when I go into a lot of details and to show how these passages make Sabbath keeping non-obligatory and of personal conviction. So for you to hold a position that you want to keep the Sabbath, that's fine. But like I said, and this is where I have a main problem with a lot of Sabbatarians, especially the most vocal, but the one who has the weakest argument, Adventism, is they make it salvific. Let me put it this way. There's not a problem with Sabbatarians, Adventists, etc., practice of Sabbath keeping. The problem is with their theology of the Sabbath. As I said earlier, I agree with you. You want to keep the Sabbath because of what it signifies. That's perfectly fine. But to suggest that my salvation is hinged on it, and if I don't keep it, I will somehow forfeit my right to be saved, and what have you, and I'm an inferior Christian, and I'm not identified as part of the body of Christ because I don't keep these things, then that is where the huge problem is. And that hinges one on the border of the Judean heretics that the New Testament, especially Paul, fought so furiously in Galatians and Colossians and a plethora of the New Testament scriptures and times. So that is my basic argument. So I'm not an anti-Sabbatarian per se. Well, I'm at variance with people who keep the Sabbath. My problem is with the theology that some have about the Sabbath, that your salvation hangs on, and if you don't keep it, you're in trouble with God.
Yeah. Thank you, Elsie. We only have a minute before we close this section, but what I would say just briefly here is that a lot of the quotes that you gave and the comments that you made about Judaism's position on the Gentiles keeping the Sabbath would be irrelevant to the discussion, because Judaism, as practiced by the Jews in the first century, was not the religion of the Old Testament. The Jews had developed their own traditions and accretions, which Jesus himself dissociated himself from. And therefore, because of their exclusivism and because of their ethnic chauvinism, they did use the Sabbath, as with circumcision and the dietary laws, as identity markers. And I'm using the phrase popularized by the great theologian James Dunn. They did use those as boundary markers. So the Jews, for their own nationalistic reasons, had the Sabbath as an institution of pride. They arrogated the Sabbath to themselves and felt that the Sabbath was theirs and was not for all mankind. The position of Sabbatarians was the Jews were ultra vires. The Sabbath was for all mankind, and they were illegitimate when they were arrogating it to themselves. So all of the quotations that you give don't really bear on this discussion, because the religion of Judaism is not the religion of the Old Testament. Elsie and I are again in dialogue on this matter of the Sabbath. He is saying that there is no continuing requirement for Sabbath observance in the New Testament, and I'm contesting that view. We take our first break on Religious Hard Talk.